Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the CARES-ESSER Grant Application Overview Webinar. My name is Erin Given, and I work within the Division of K-12 Systems and Support at OSSI, and I'm the CARES-ESSER Grant Manager. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. As you come into the webinar, you're automatically placed on mute to cut down on background noise. The webinar will be recorded, and we'll post it to the OSSI Cares website after the presentation, along with the slide deck. I've added the slide deck and two other reference documents that we'll discuss to the meeting notes. Since everyone's on mute, in your control panel, you'll see a question box. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you can type the questions into the question box, and I'll be stopping periodically to answer questions as we go. At the end of the presentation, we'll also have some time for questions and answers. The purpose of this webinar is to review the CARES-ESSER grant and specifically how to apply for the fiscal year 2021 portion of the grant in OSSI's Enterprise Grant Management System, or EEMS. We'll go over the grant background, eligibility, allowable uses, grant timeline, and the EEMS application. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act, was signed into law on March 27, 2020, and it provides funding to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus or COVID-19 public health emergency. Within the CARES Act is the Educational Stabilization Fund, which includes several programs to support schools in their response to COVID-19. One program within the Educational Stabilization Fund is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER. And you'll hear this referred to as CARES-ESSER, and that's the program we're here to discuss. CARES-ESSER includes formula funds to provide LEAs with emergency relief funds to address the impact COVID-19 has had and continues to have on elementary and secondary schools. This includes distance learning and recovery learning. CARES-ESSER is a formula grant to LEAs, like I just said, and it's based on the proportion of Title I Part A funds that the LEAs received in the most recent fiscal year, which is the 2019-2020 school year. Final allocations were released a couple weeks ago, and they include adjustments for public charter schools that are new and significantly expanding in the school year 2021 as required by the U.S. Department of Education. If you're not a new or significantly expanding public charter school, your final allocation increased by about 1% compared to your preliminary allocation. If you are a new public charter school, you will have received a CARES-ESSER allocation for the first time, and OSSI sent out notifications when we released the final allocations a couple weeks ago. If you reported to OSSI this past spring that you're significantly expanding in school year 2021, your CARES-ESSER final allocation increased based on the projected K through 12 enrollment. Final allocations are posted to the OSSI Cares website and can also be found in this link here. Definitely reach out if you have any questions or if you need clarification on your LEA's final allocation. I also wanted to note that in case anyone on the line is representing an LEA that did not qualify for CARES-ESSER funds, OSSI recognizes that the current situation is impacting all public schools, including those that don't receive Title I funds. So to help meet the needs of all schools, OSSI was approved by the Department of Education to amend the SOAR grant program to provide CARES equivalent allocations to LEAs that are not eligible for CARES funding because they do not receive Title I funds. That application is expected to release this October. Although ESSER funds are distributed to LEAs based on Title I allocations, they're not Title I funds. ESSER is its own separate flexible program intended to support schools' COVID-19 response. So certain Title I requirements, such as supplement, not supplant, don't apply to ESSER funds. CARES-ESSER allowable uses are broad to address the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had and continues to have on your LEA. Allowable uses include costs prompted by COVID-19, so sanitation supplies, PPE, increased technology infrastructure, learning management systems, et cetera. And it also includes activities allowable under existing federal grant programs, including ESEA, IDEA, McKinney-Vento, Carl D. Perkins, and the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act. Information regarding CARES-ESSER allowable uses can be accessed on the OSSI CARES website, and I've also posted an allowable uses guide to the webinar attachments. This allowable uses guide highlights relevant allowable uses within the CARES Act and across federal programs. So this is a kind of like high-level one-pager, and then the guide also includes a one-pager for each of those federal programs we mentioned that provides more detail on the allowable uses within them. And we understand that your needs in response to COVID-19 might be very unique, so reach out to us at the OSSI CARES email with specific questions on allowability. The period of availability for CARES-ESSER funds is March 13th, 2020 through September 30th, 2022. This means your LEA can request reimbursements for allowable costs incurred back to the date the President declared a national emergency, which is March 13th, 2020. For federal and local auditing and reporting purposes, we're required to break out the grant application by fiscal year. So fiscal year 20, fiscal year 21, and fiscal year 22. LEAs have flexibility, though, in how funds are distributed across fiscal year. Unless you've already requested an adjustment, EGMS is loaded with default allocation distributions of 30% of your LEA's total allocation for FY20, 40% for FY21, and 30% for FY22. However, CARES-ESSER is a flexible program, and LEAs can request changes to the distribution across fiscal years by completing the LEA request form for an allocation adjustment. For example, your LEA might request 0% of their allocation for FY20 and 100% for FY21 if all planned spending is between October 1st, 2020 and September 30th, 2021. Alternatively, if your LEA plans to spend their entire allocation prior to the end of September 30th, 2020, then you might request that 100% of your allocation be loaded in FY20 and 0% in 21 and 22. Any adjustment requests that were already submitted before August 14th are reflected in EGMS. And we'll walk through the adjustment request form and some specific scenarios in a minute. The application we're discussing today is specifically for FY21, and that runs from October 1st, 2020 through September 30th, 2021. The FY21 applications will be reviewed on a rolling basis as they're received, and they're due in EGMS by September 30th, 2021. You're eligible to apply for FY20 even if you did not apply for you're eligible to apply for FY21 even if you did not apply to FY20. We've received that question a few times. The FY20 application is also still open, and that runs from March 13th, 2020 through September 30th, 2020. And it's due no later, it's due in EGMS no later than September 30th, this September 30th. So in order to reimburse costs from the period going back to March 13th through this September 30th, you must submit your application by September 30th, 2020. And then any funds budgeted for FY20 and EGMS will carry over to FY21 once the EGMS closeout process is complete. So these funds don't lapse. If you budget them for FY20, but you end up not spending them, they'll eventually roll over, they'll carry over into FY21 once you complete closeout of your FY20 application. So here's what the LEA request form looks like to adjust. LEAs can request a different distribution of their allocation than the default amounts by completing the CARES-ESSER Allocation Adjustment Form found in the link on this slide. And the link was also is also included in the most recent LEA Look Forward, which was sent out on last Friday. The form looks like this and includes just a few short questions. Your email address, your LEA name, your name and job title, and the amount your LEA needs in each fiscal year. Please note that the form should be filled out by an LEA leader or by a fiscal grant staff member that will be included in the EEMS application contact list. That way we can make sure that it's an official request. There are some cases where we received requests to adjust FY20 allocations from the default, but did not receive information on FY21 and FY22 plan spending. In these cases, the default FY21 allocation may be more or less than the 40% default that we discussed. So for example, if you requested less than 30% be loaded in FY20, the difference would be loaded in FY21. So if you requested 0% be loaded in FY20, but when you did that request, it was before FY21 information was available, we would have a default load of 70% for FY21 and 30% for FY22. There's a lot of unique situations with this across LEAs, so please reach out with any specific questions. Here are some tips based on questions we've received frequently. First, your EEMS application budget must match your EEMS allocation in order to submit your application. And we'll get into this in more detail later in the presentation. If you already know that you don't need the full FY20 allocation default, completing the adjustment request form will give you access to the funds you need in FY20 sooner. So if you let us know now how much you need for FY20, then you'd have access to the remaining funds by October 1st. Otherwise, you need any funds budgeted in FY20 but not actually spent down in FY20 will eventually carry over into FY21, but not until closeout of the FY20 grant is complete, which is usually around January. LEAs may submit multiple adjustment requests. We know that this is a dynamic time, and if your needs change as your COVID response changes, you can change your planned spending by fiscal year by refilling out the form. Allocation adjustments will be made periodically. Any requests received by this September 11th will be loaded into EEMS by September 18th. After that, requests received by the 1st of the month will be available in EEMS by the 8th of the month. Before we move ahead, are there any questions on this? You can type them into the question box. It looks like we're good, but please feel free to at any time type in a question and I can stop to address it. Now we're going to move on to the EEMS application itself. Oh, can you carry over more than 15% of FY20? Great question. Yes, you can carry over anything that you don't spend. So there's no timing restrictions on this grant. It's a grant that runs all the way from March 13th, 2020 through September 30th, 2021. So as long as you spend everything by September 30th, 2022, then you will have no lapse of funds and there's no restrictions in how much you carry over or how much you budget in a given fiscal year. Does that answer your question, Stacy? Cool, great. Moving on. And again, feel free to stop with any questions. I know that this can get confusing with all the dates. Okay, we have another question. Are these adjustments application amendments? And if we submit by 9/11, we'll know if we're approved by 9/18. No. So yes, they will require an application amendment. So if you submit a change to your either FY20 or 21 budget by allocation by September 11th, then it will be loaded in EEMS by September 18th. And at that time, you're going to need to amend your application to the new increased or decreased allocation amount. And then once you amend your application and resubmit it, we'll approve it. And we'll really do our best. I know that, like, especially with anything on FY20, if we have any concerns with approving your application, we'll have a quick turnaround with that. Okay, so does that answer your question, Kim? Cool. So let's move on to the EGMS application itself. Applications must be submitted in EGMS, and that can be found at this link. And yeah, great question. So Rainu is a member of our CARES-ESSER grant team, and she asked, if an LEA has an approved FY20 application, can they still do a reallocation? Yes, you can still do a reallocation. So if you said that you thought you only needed $50,000 and now you need $80,000 for fiscal year 20, you still have time to do the amendment. So just do fill out the form, we'll load it in EGMS, and then you can amend and we'll approve your application, review and approve. Okay, so sorry, I jumped ahead now. Applications must be submitted through EGMS, and the link is here. The FY21 application is identical to the FY20 application aside from a few date changes. And again, we've kind of gone over dates, but the FY20 EGMS application is for allowable costs planned from March 13th, 2020 through September 30th, 2020. And the FY21 application is for allowable costs planned for October 1st, 2020 through September 30th, 2021. The EGMS application will contain the following sections or tabs. We'll discuss each of these in detail. And I just want to note there's no programmatic narratives required in this application, so the bulk of the application is on the detailed planned expenditure tabs. The first tab is the overview tab. You should review this section for general information about the grant. And this tab lists allowable uses as written in the CARES Act, which will be helpful as you think through your LEA's plan needs. And this is the legislation we look at as you ask very unique questions about allowable uses. This will kind of get into more detail of what the law actually says is allowable. The next tab is the award administration tab. Here you'll find the terms and conditions of the grant. And these two sections are informational only, so there's no fields to complete here. The next section is the assurances tab. You'll be required to read through each assurance and check the box to indicate that your LEA is read, understood, and will comply with the assurances. Note that one of the assurances in the list is on equitable services for private school students and should be completed by DCPS only. So please don't check this box unless you're DCPS, and DCPS only is noted at the end of that specific assurance. The first assurance requires a narrative description. So let's look at the narrative assurance in more detail. So it's described in 1 to 2 paragraphs how the LEA, when using CARES Act grant funds, will ensure that students, teachers, and other beneficiaries with special needs have equitable access to and participation in grant-funded activities. Potential barriers that can impede equal access and participation include barriers based on gender, race, color, national origin, disability, and age. A sample answer to that assurance could be, we will use CARES-ESSER funds to purchase computers and laptops as part of our school-wide technology upgrade. Because a significant portion of our students are from families where Spanish is the primary language spoken at home, we will provide user instructions for the computers both in Spanish and in English. Please ensure when you are completing this narrative assurance that it's related to the items and initiatives that you list in your detailed plan spending. So if your narrative talks about your LEA's COVID response, but it doesn't include work that's being done with the CARES Act funds, your application will not be approvable. Are there any questions on that? Okay. You will be required to enter the contact information for your LEA's executive director or head of school, as well as 2 other primary program contacts like the grant manager or fiscal manager. You also can enter information for up to 5 additional LEA contacts. And please make sure that the person responsible for completing the application is included in the contact list. This tab is important because individuals listed here will receive automated approval or disapproval notices for the application. On this tab, you'll find your LEA's FY21 allocation. As discussed earlier in the presentation, the default will be 40% of your LEA's allocation. If you've requested that your FY21 allocation be adjusted, you'll see the revised amount here when it's available. It's important that your planned detailed expenditures match this amount before you submit the application, or the system won't let you submit. So the amount listed here is going to need to match the amount that you actually budget in the detailed planned expenditures that we're about to get to. A little tip is that if you have reimbursements that you need to process immediately, you can submit an application using your default budget and then amend once the reimbursement request has been processed. And then your allocation adjustment is finalized in EEMS. Yeah, so I see a question. Were there funds for non-Title I schools in FY20? No, so I'm not completely sure what date. I'm gonna have to follow up with you. So that application, the CARES Equitable grant, is going to launch sometime in October, and I don't know how far back you can reimburse. So I can follow up with you on that. So this funding distribution tab is informational and there's no fields to complete. For the detailed planned expenditures, you'll need to fill out your planned CARES spending in fiscal year 2021 for each of the 5 budget categories: salary and benefits, professional services, equipment, supplies and materials, and fixed property costs. Each expenditure line requires a CARES budget code detailing the type of expense and how it is in line with allowable uses of CARES funds. These codes will also help us facilitate reporting requirements at the state and federal level. So here are the CARES budget codes that you'll use in your application. There might be cases where more than one code is appropriate. In this case, please choose the most specific code available. For example, regression mitigation activities for students with disabilities should be marked SWD, which is support for students with disabilities, specialized instructions-related services, assisted technology, interventions, targeted support, and regression mitigation, even though it could also be coded as other. The other code is really for things that don't fall into the CARES COVID response specific. So things that are allowable under other federal programs like ESEA, IDA, Kenny-Vento, Perkins, and AFLA. And then the EQU code is for non-public equitable services. That is specifically for DCPS and should not be used by LEAs other than DCPS. And that's for equitable services for students in private schools. And this list is linked at the top of each of the detailed planned expenditures tabs, and I'll show an example of where to find that. And then I also included it in the handouts. Here's what itemized expenditures for salaries and benefits, the tab looks like. You'll find a link to the CARES budget codes I just mentioned here at the top. And on each of these tabs, there's going to be a link to those budget codes. You have to fill out information for each planned expenditure. So for salaries and benefits, you'll include the name of the individual plan for the work, the position title, select the budget code from the drop-down, and then the percentage of their time on CARES-ESSER funding and a description of the expenditure and total plan cost. For the other categories, professional services, equipment, supplies and materials, and fixed property costs, you'll need to include the item to be purchased, the CARES budget code from the drop-down, a brief description of the purpose of the purchase, and then the amount to be budgeted. Your description should be detailed enough that it's clear that there are linked to allowable uses. So it should include what goods or services will be delivered, to whom and when they should be delivered. And it should also include information explaining the cost basis of the item, such as the number of units of a good. And this section can include up to 1,000 characters. So here's an example of an itemized expenditure entry that is not approvable versus one that is approvable. So in the first, the incomplete entry, the item to be purchased listed as laptops, the budget code DEV, which is distance learning for laptops and tablets. A brief description of the purpose of the purchase is to facilitate distance learning. And while this is clearly linked to allowable uses and the budget code's appropriate, it doesn't give us enough information to understand the cost basis. So an example of a complete entry is items to be purchased, 25 laptops, the same budget code, and then a more detailed description that tells us how much is being purchased and when. So our LEA purchased 25 laptop computers as part of our school-wide technology upgrade to facilitate distance learning. These computers were purchased in October 2020 and have been distributed to students without access to a computer or laptop. And are there any questions on that? Yeah, and where it makes sense, the cost of each unit would be helpful as well. So if it was 25 laptops at $400 a piece, that, like, the more detailed you are, like, the more likely it is we're gonna clearly be able to understand how you got to the amount being budgeted and verify that it's allowable, and then approve your application. The last part of the detailed planned expenditures is the budget summary tab. It provides a summary of cost by CARES budget codes and budget category. So this is automatically populated with information from the itemized expenditure tabs, and there's no fields to complete on this tab, but you should review it to ensure that your expenditures are placed in the correct categories. Now on to the submit tab. Submissions are due by 3 p.m. on September 30th, 2021. And just a reminder that for the FY20 application, the deadline's this September 30th, 2020. Please avoid technical issues by submitting early. On this tab, you're gonna run a consistency check, lock the application, and then hit the submit button. And the submit button is going to be unavailable after 3 p.m. on the due date. The application print tab is available if you need hard copies of the application. And please note that EGMS generates PDFs only once per hour when you're printing. And the application history tab is available to see all actions involving the application. So that's it for the application. We put together some tips based on common reasons that applications are sent back for changes. First, the budget code should be as specific as possible. So I mentioned the other code should only be used, generally should only be used for activities allowable under those other federal grant programs. Salaries and benefits generally should use a human capital code. If codes are used that aren't appropriate for the expenditure description, the application will not be approvable. So for example, if you code something like cleaning supplies with the devices code that's meant for things like laptops, we wouldn't be able to approve your application. And then another reminder that equitable services EQU code should only be used by DCPS. And it's a requirement for providing equitable services for students in private schools that only applies to them. For the narrative assurances, make sure that what you write there speaks to items and initiatives that are included in the detailed planned expenditures. So we've seen where an LEA application might give a really great narrative assurance explaining their COVID-19 response and how it's equitable. But then we look at the detailed planned expenditures and it's something totally different than what they're talking about in their narrative assurance. So there should be a link there. For the detailed planned expenditures, like we kind of just discussed, include information on the cost assumptions used to determine the budget. So this could include the number of items planned to be purchased, so 400 laptops, PEE for 300 students. Depending on the actual service or item being purchased, it also might make sense to include the length of time and frequency of the service. So an example could be daily deep cleaning services of all common areas for the first quarter of the semester. And for staff, include the time frame that they're paid out of CARES-ESSER funds. So 50% of their salary from October 1st, 2020 through March 15th, 2021 is being paid out of CARES-ESSER funds. Just remember, we need to be able to determine that costs are reasonable when we're reviewing your application. And one last tip that's come up a couple of times is please ensure that the percentage of staff time allocated to the CARES-ESSER funding is accurate. So I'll scroll back real quick to the personnel tab. So you have to include the percentage of staff time allocated to CARES funding. If a staff person is working 40 hours a week and 20 hours of that are CARES funded, then the percentage would be 50%. If they're working 40 hours a week and 40 hours is CARES funded, then it's 100%. So I'd like to open the floor to questions. I see that Kim Swenson just submitted a question. Because of a DC law requiring all staff to have proper materials when working remotely, many schools are planning to pay a monthly expense for staff internet, home office, etc. Would that expense be allowable under CARES? If so, what type of backup documentation would be required? That's a really great question. I'm going to give a short answer, and then I would love to run it by our team and our legal, just to make sure that I'm giving you a complete answer. So to me, it sounds allowable. I think that the important thing to remember is that there's some federal regulations that you would need to provide something like that to all staff, and I'll again send out more information on exactly what that regulation is. And then the backup documentation, let's see, so monthly expenses to staff for internet, I think that would include something like the number of staff, the approximate cost per staff, and then when you do your reimbursements, make sure you're detailing, the staff member and their actual expenditures so that we know that it's accurate, and then keep records on hand for future monitoring. So receipts of the expenditures. Does that answer your question, Kim, at least for now? And again, I will send out some more details. I think that would be reasonable for your budget, for your application. In terms of reimbursement, I think you would need to have some way to verify that that's an actual cost they need. Otherwise, it's sort of like a stipend. And what I'll do is I'll follow up with our legal to see if that would be a reasonable approach. It's you provide each staff member with a $50 stipend to address these needs. And I'm not sure, I'm going to have to follow up with you on that. Cool. Are there any other questions? Okay, take your time. Oh wait, let's see. Yep, I will send that out. It's a really great question. Yeah, reach out with any other specific questions. You can reach me directly at erin.given@dc.gov, or you can email the OSSI Cares email address, and myself and my team check that. You also might have already heard from a member of our CARES team. Our team includes Rainu Oliver, Mildred Washington, Rachel Stafford, and Mabel Kennedy. So feel free to reach out to them if you have, if you've been corresponding with them. They're an awesome team, and we work very closely together to make sure we're supporting you all. And then for technical EGMS issues, you can call the EGMS Help Desk at 202-719-6500. So I'll give you another moment in case there's any additional questions. Otherwise, email me if you think of anything later. So thank you all for your time. I appreciate it. Thanks.